I'm Sarnata Reynolds. I work for Oxfam International, and I'm the head of policy and research for our humanitarian campaigning. It is such a pleasure to be here with all of you today. Thank you for coming to hear about what I think will be a really inspiring and creative discussion over the next hour and 15 minutes. I wanted to start today with a story of a family that I know, because the numbers we're talking about today are so huge, and I think sometimes it's most useful to start from the individual. So in 1973, a little boy was born in a small rural town in Honduras. He was the firstborn in his family, and he was prized by his parents. A lovely young boy, a funny boy, a trickster. He grew, of course, like we all do, and he gained a younger brother who he adored. And he learned how to dance with girls, and he drank a little with the boys, and he fell in love, and he had a daughter who became his prize. And at the age of 19, he had to flee his country because he was being chased by a gang. A gang that, unlike Ramon, had multinational fingers and a deadly body of work. Ramon paid a smuggler, and he made his way through Mexico for over 2 months. And he suffered there alongside other refugees and migrants who were also fleeing for their lives, fleeing to find livelihood, and so many of the other many reasons that people make decisions that they don't want to make to leave their homes and everything they know. When he finally did reach the US border, the Mexico-US border, he was excited and happy, of course. He'd finally made his way. And 3 days later, he was dead in the desert of Arizona. He had died of dehydration. Ramon was identified and sent home to his family because he had a distinct tattoo on his body that was traceable. And it was a tattoo of about his little daughter. It was her name. And because a whole range of NGOs got involved to help identify the family, to help arrange for his transportation, and to allow his body to be returned home in dignity to his family, where he could be buried with his community. His story, unfortunately, is not unique. I started with it because his is one of so many stories of the more than 65 million people who are on the run right now, whether across borders as refugees or internally inside their own countries as what we call internally displaced people, or IDPs. And that number is impossible to fathom. But it is made up of mothers and daughters, of brothers and of granddads, of people who loved their families, just like we all love our families, who loved their homes and the peculiarities and the frustrations and the joys, and had to leave them. Excuse me. I'm so honored that today to be moderating this panel of people who are made up of refugees and the advocates who work with them to support their rights. They have recorded these stories or lived these experiences themselves. And through these experiences, they have built the scaffolding of support for refugee and migrant rights. And they've done it while governments have failed to build the walls and the roofs that people deserve and have a right to in international protection around the world. It often feels, I live in the United States and here in the UK too, and Europe, of course, it often feels like there are so many refugees in this area. And of course, it has caused a huge amount of political upheaval and certainly the rise of xenophobia. But the reality is that the vast majority of refugees live in the global south. In fact, only 1% of refugees will make it to the United States or Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, or Europe. Just 1%. The vast majority stay close to home and live in conditions that continue to be dangerous. And if not dangerous, just difficult, really difficult. And today we're going to hear from people who intervene in those moments, those critical moments when people need help just to get on with their own lives. I've no doubt you'll come away today inspired with new ideas about how you can support this refugee and human rights-based system. And with that, I'd like to introduce our panel. Although first, I just realized I got some logistics for you. Please silence your cell phones. Please wait for the microphone before speaking, so someone will come around with the microphone so we can catch you for the video that we are putting forward. And after the session, please take a few seconds to fill out our survey. So I'm going to introduce each person as we go through the panel, because I want to make sure that we have lots of time for your questions and comments as well. The first person who's going to speak is Jay Assad, and he is actually going to speak by Skype. And hopefully we'll have him here. He will be joined by Fleur, sorry, on the end here. They are colleagues and friends, and they met about a year ago when Jay was in a camp, a refugee camp in Netherlands. He is from Syria. He is a successful business leader. He had a construction company. He had a donut shop. He had a whole line of different types of businesses, had done very well, but had been forced to flee without his family, and was lucky enough to meet with Fleur in the Netherlands. Fleur was looking for an opportunity to match skills in the camp with livelihood, with businesses, and they clicked immediately. It sounds like it was serendipitous, and I'll stop there. It'll be first Jay speaking from Skype, and then we'll have Fleur also add on to his comments about what they do with Refugee Company. Thank you, Jay.
Hello. Good morning to everybody, and thank you for inviting me to speak on this respected panel. And for me, I want to first just say that I am a refugee for now 2 years. Okay, 1 year I spent in the camp, and 2 years ago when I took the decision to flee, it was not an easy one. I actually lived most of my life as an expat, but in 2011 I decided to go back to Syria, be with my family with this crisis, thinking that it might take only a year and then it will be over. Apparently it took longer than that, and then by almost the end of 2014, that's when I decided that that's it, I can't wait any longer. I think it's getting really dangerous, especially with ISIS getting really close to where we were living. And I took the decision to take the flight by myself because it was too dangerous. And I took the flight that everybody is talking about, the one that goes to Turkey and then by rubber boat to Greece. And then I was fortunate enough to be able to fly from Athens to Amsterdam. And then, arrived there, and where my my journey as a refugee really started, because before that it was really dangerous, but at the same time it was one that kept my mind really occupied with how I'm going to be able to survive. So I was in that survival mode. It was not as bad as when you sit and in a comfort of a safety, but then you start realizing the real problem that you are in, which is you are a person with no future. And I think it really struck me when I first sat in that room by myself and thinking that, well, am I going to be like this for the rest of my life, or what's going on, It didn't take me long to realize that although there's a lot of people who wants to help you, but you are dealing with a big system that apparently you're not going to reach the jobs that you want. You see, you have to understand, refugees are people who are took this trip against their will. They had a successful life, sometimes even a week before they took the decision. And they want to go back to their normal life, to the level of living that they had, to the standard they were used to. And that is, believe me, it's sometimes is as bad as being in a war zone. That, you feel like you have no future, no prospects, and you're just going to end up a person who takes help and subsidy for the rest of your life. Or maybe after 5 years, they come and tell you, well, the only job we have for you is probably cleaning, or, just a mediocre job. And then that would be a problem, because you have already got depressed and used to the doing nothing style of life. And for me, I took the decision to do something about that point, probably about a couple of months, after I arrived. I started doing this course inside the camp about entrepreneurship, because I felt the best way to do is let's create our own path, not wait for the government to find me a job. And I believe that with this influx of the huge amounts of people, there's going to be a lot of demand for new niche markets for these kind of people. So it really did well. And then when I met Fleur Bakker, of course, we started really implementing my ideas and hers, into real stuff. That we believe that the best thing to do is let's do the work and then talk. Because what I saw that if you go through the regular way of doing business, probably you'll be meetings and meetings and meetings, and that's it. Well, we immediately started connecting people to, let's say, as a refugee, the biggest thing that you lost is really your contacts and your network. So we thought the best thing is at least let's introduce a refugee to someone who's doing the same job that he was doing, or he would like to do in the future, and let him explore what are the possibilities of him doing it in this country. Well, we realized, let's say, for example, there was a carpenter, he thought that the way work that he was doing back home is not at the level of Netherlands. When I took him and I introduced him to this carpenter, and a Dutch gentleman, the guy came back with enthusiastic. He wants to do work because he believed he's actually even better than this guy and he can improve in his work. So I think that really shows that, once you see maybe just a glimpse of light at the end of the tunnel, then you become at least with a hope that, you're going to one day reach a job that is something that's meaningful to you. So for me, starting that was like really the most important, because I was one also like those guys that we want to help. And for me, I felt, talking about doing business to these guys and just talking is not going to really provide a real proof to these guys. So I felt that then maybe I should do it myself. I should start my own business. Then if they ask me what are the hurdles that I've experienced, then I have a real practical answer for these guys. And this is exactly what I did. Of course, we have moved to this new place called Bijlmer Bijes, which is an old jail complex in Amsterdam. And we have a big atelier. Of course, Fleur Bakker will be able to speak more about the details about the refugee company. I would like to just say that I started also my own foundation. It's called Refugee, and it is aimed at helping refugee entrepreneurs in the food industry strictly, and within under the umbrella of Refugee, now I have a startup kitchen, which is a business that I already started doing catering. I have the other one, which is Baladi Foods, also a cheese and dairy production company that is at already got the funding and ready to launch in about 2 weeks. The third one is Full Falafel, which is an enterprise to start the first franchise, food franchise for refugees, owned and operated by refugees. And with this, I think I can start, encouraging others to come in with their ideas, where we can help them out to scale them up.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for starting to open up to us about all of these incredible ideas you have here. I think this is another demonstration of this entrepreneur. I'm going to now actually hand it over to Fleur so you can talk a little bit more about Refugee Company. Thank you, Jay.
Thank you, Jay. So, as Jay was explaining you, I'm Fleur. I'm one of the founders of Refugee Company and director, together with Jay. What you see on this picture is the Bijlmer Bijes, which is a former prison in the Netherlands, actually close to it's on the borders of Amsterdam. You see these big towers behind the colorful wall. 600 refugees are living there. and we've built up a space, a safe space where newcomers can connect to locals. And I will just give you 3 minutes of. It's much easier if you would be in our space, so it's harder to get the same experience here. So this is our. This is actually the former laundry of the prison. We created a safe space with a lot of small enterprises. So what you see is our terrace here. Doesn't work. Yeah. So here you see inside, this is our opening. We had between 2,000 and 3,000 people attending to our opening, and we expected around 400, so we had a little bit of a stress with the food. And what you see on the back is our sewing atelier. We have a very holistic approach. So if a newcomer comes to us, we first ask, so what did you do in your home country? Who are you? What did you study or you didn't study? And what are your dreams here in the Netherlands? And then we see how we can find the next step to rebuild your professional life from our network. And what you see behind Katja, who is talking there, this is our offline database. I know that there have been 15,000 apps developed, I think, in the past 2 years to connect locals and newcomers. But we do everything very visual and offline. So all these little yellow sticky notes are people who we've met in the shelters or who reached out on Facebook to us. And we try to connect them. So for instance, an engineer from Syria to a Dutch engineer to at least start building a network. What for us is really important that we try to eliminate any sense of pity, negativity, because there has been so much said about the refugee crisis the past 2 years in the media. So for us it's really important to focus on talent, on positive stories, on making very professional products and not, just make a little handbag for the sake of it, but really launch a professional tailor-made shirt. I just wanted to explain one example. This is Mr. Khaled. I met him in the emergency shelter and he's 59. He fled alone and he only spoke Arabic, and then we were meeting a few times and then we spoke, and then I found out that he was a tuxedo maker in his country. So then we connected him while he was still in emergency shelter to a big sewing atelier in Amsterdam. And he made actually for some CEOs, he made tailor-made suits. And it was, for us, it was a big struggle because you're not allowed to do any work in the emergency shelter. You're not allowed to do voluntary work. You're not allowed to study. So we had to really go into this gray area, phoning a lot with the municipality, please, let this man be active for 2 or 3 days a week because he really is depressed in the shelter. So that's how we also try to approach it, that whatever is necessary for this man to be able to go back to his skills, we try to go through the system. These are all examples of projects we did. Basically we do 3 things. We build strong networks, but we also try to find work experience, internships, temporary small jobs, because if you have your CV or your LinkedIn profile from maybe Iran, we don't know these companies. So it's very good to build up small work experience in the Netherlands to top up your CV. This is a dentist we met he was working in a kitchen in a restaurant, and he came through the medical assessment in the Netherlands. And he just finished his studies in Syria for 6 years. And he had to start all over again in the Netherlands. And my sister is an orthodontist, so I phoned her and I knew that she was short on staff. She was recruiting people from Spain and Argentina. And now he works there for 8 months. And with him, it's he has his job now, his house, but he's still suffering from a lot of psychological things. So we still need to support people while they are working. We also are looking to a shortage on the labor market. For instance, solar panel installers, there's a shortage on the labor market in the Netherlands. So we try to connect to big corporates and to companies and to train people. This is our space. This is the sewing atelier. We have a coffee bar where Boca is a coffee brand. They train baristas, and that's actually a very good project because you don't need to speak the language. You just have to have a passion for coffee. Yeah, and it's funny because the Eritrean have a very different taste of coffee, so we have a lot of discussion. This is our young group of designers launching a t-shirt brand. This is our silkscreen workshop. Yeah, we had Ai Weiwei even visiting us, which was... And well, the last two things I want to say is last week we launched our web shop. So we make shirts for men and women. So it would be nice to order one because we ship also to the UK. But it's still building up, but it's really nice. And actually the photo shoot, the makeup, everything is done by refugees from the shelter. And the last thing, we will launch in a few weeks a restaurant, which is not a real restaurant. The name is A Beautiful Mess. And we see it as more as a transformative platform. So we work together with 30 restaurants to build up these restaurants. And it's really because there's a shortage on staff in the hospitality sector in Amsterdam. So we will train people, and actually the refugee will be the client and not the consumer will be the client. So you were a cook in your country and then you became a refugee, and in our restaurant you're a cook again. Yeah, and any other thing you want to know, you can check on our website.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So obviously you did already, the first two speakers, just incredible ideas being put into practice. One of the things I wanted to pick up, Fleur, was when you were talking about the gentleman in the emergency shelter who had these skills and really needed to sort of get some work. And there was this gray area you were trying to manage between rights and law. Yeah. And Emily Arnold Fernandez, who's our next speaker, started an organization called Asylum Access 12 years ago. She's a human rights lawyer, and it actually is a good example of some of the space that Asylum Access works in, sort of trying to connect what are real rights to the ability to exercise them within laws. Maybe you can go from there.
So you all heard Sarnata say at the beginning that organizations, and this was such an inspiring story, by the way, just hearing about everything you're doing, but organizations and individuals have come in to fill the gaps in a global architecture that is not letting refugees rebuild their lives. And at Asylum Access, we believe that it's possible to change that global architecture. So that's what we're dedicated to. We're dedicated to building a world where refugees can live safely, can move freely, can work and feed their families without the restrictions of law that you heard a little bit about, can rebuild their lives. So we've all seen photos like this in the news. This is the kind of thing that has made us all much more aware of the situation that refugees face around the world. But what we don't see is information about really the scope and duration of the problem, right? So Sarnata gave a few numbers, but 21 million refugees in the world, people who fled war or targeted persecution because of something about them and have had to leave their home country because of that. Less than 1%, as Sarnata said, getting to the global north. So most people remaining in Africa, Asia, or Latin America, just a border away from conflict often. About half the world's refugees are in what are considered protracted refugee situations. That means that at least 25,000 people have been displaced for at least 5 years or more. And today, the average duration of a protracted refugee situation, the average, is 26 years. So think about what you were doing 26 years ago. And what happens during those 26 years is that people are either locked up in camps. For those of you who are Americans, you know we had a shameful period in our history when we interned, when we locked up Japanese Americans. That's essentially what refugee camps are. Barbed wire, not allowed to leave, almost everywhere in the world. There are a few exceptions, but almost everywhere that there are refugee camps, refugees are not allowed to leave them. And for the refugees who aren't in camps, they may be free to some degree to move. They may be at risk of being detained and imprisoned if they move in the country that they're in. But they're also almost never allowed to work, to put their kids in school, to open a bank account, to rent an apartment, to do the things that we would take for granted as being required to start a life. And it's not that refugees don't do these things in 26 years, but it's that they have to do them unlawfully without the protections that we all count on, right? So if your employer says, I'm not going to pay you this week, right? All of us could probably do something about that. We'd probably have some sort of recourse. The law wouldn't let the employer get away with it. But for refugees, that's often the reality. And so how do we change this? For asylum access, we see that this involves moving from just a system, from a system that's only based on aid, that's only based on meeting those immediate needs the day someone comes across a border, to a system that restores refugees' agency. And that means understanding that refugees are people with rights as well as people with needs, and then investing to make those rights a reality. So how do we do that? We do that in two ways. We focus on changing laws in first countries of refuge. Right? And that's the big elephant in the room here. Right? We can provide someone with food, but if they're not allowed to work, they have no pathway to a sustainable life. So we have to change that. And we're increasingly seeing new actors come on board, powerful actors come on board. Asylum Access is a small NGO. We're not going to change it alone. But the World Bank, for example, has done some really innovative work in making loans contingent upon a country allowing refugees to work, allowing refugees to start businesses. And University of Oxford here has done some really interesting research to show that when you do that, refugees actually contribute to the economy. They make things better for everyone. So Oxford looked at Uganda, for example, and found that 40% of the refugee entrepreneurs who were hiring others were hiring Ugandans, right? They became job creators in Uganda. That's what happens when you have the right policy frameworks in place. And yet, almost no countries allow refugees to work. And so I'd like to tell you a couple of stories. And the first is about Thailand and what it looks like when a country is just taking those first steps to having the right policy frameworks in place. So in Thailand, the government has historically not accepted refugees, not been willing to allow them to access work. In fact, many people who probably qualified as refugees in Thailand decided not to identify as refugees and decided to identify as economic migrants instead and to sign up as a migrant worker because it meant they could at least work, they could at least feed themselves and their families. It meant they could at least have something to do during the day that gave their life purpose and meaning. But Thailand recently has started to take a few steps toward actually recognizing refugees and saying, oh, maybe we should be integrating folks. Maybe we should be allowing folks to work legally so they're not working illegally and driving down wages and working conditions. And the way that this came about was putting pressure on Thailand, utilizing what's called the Universal Periodic Review process, utilizing other governments putting pressure on Thailand and saying, hey, you really need to commit to something, to making some changes. And Thailand did in September at a couple of historic refugee summits. And following that, we saw that for the very first time, we had a 16-year-old refugee from Somalia who'd taken refuge in Thailand. Thailand has 40 different nationalities of refugees. 16 years old, fled the war in Somalia, or the violence in Somalia, took refuge in Thailand, was on a school field trip, and got arrested. Because Thailand's made a few strides, but they haven't gotten there all the way yet. Got arrested on this school field trip and thrown in detention and brought up before the court on charges of being illegally in Thailand, right? So they weren't even gonna let him go to school, stay in Thailand, maybe grow up and get a job. They were saying, we're gonna put you in prison because you came to Thailand illegally and you're in Thailand illegally. But the winds of change are blowing in Thailand. And so a juvenile court heard this case and said, you know what, no, that's not okay. This child is here by reason of necessity. He can't go back to Somalia. He must have some way to stay here lawfully. And if you don't have a way, then you need to find a way. You may not punish him for illegal presence. you may not deport him back to Somalia. You have to find a way to regularize his status and let him remain in Thailand. And on the flip side, we know that when we move this direction, when we start to have the right laws in place to let refugees stay, to let refugees work, to let them rebuild their lives, we see that amazing things can happen. And so in Ecuador, just a country that's much further on this spectrum, that has agreed to let refugees work and move freely and rebuild their lives, we see that the next piece, and maybe the last piece of the puzzle, is making sure that those laws are meaningful, that those laws are enforced. And so, and I'm gonna skip ahead here. So we worked with a group of refugee women in Ecuador. And our goal really was to help them understand what those laws said, right? And how those laws protected them and allowed them to work and take care of their families. And I had the privilege of sitting in on one of our women's groups a few years ago. And we just started, people were just getting ready to talk and support each other and share their stories. And a woman comes rushing in. She said, ladies, I'm sorry, I know I'm interrupting, I know I'm late, but I have to tell you what just happened, right? And she said, my employer told me he's not going to pay Social Security and other benefits for me, which in Ecuador are pretty significant. Ecuador has a pretty solid welfare state. And he said he didn't have to pay them for me because I was just a refugee. And she said, I told him I'm a refugee and I have rights. And she proceeded to explain to him why, under the law, he was required to pay her fairly, to pay her equally with Ecuadorians. She stood up for herself. She didn't need anything more than that knowledge and the support of her community, because the next thing she said was, 6 months ago, I never would have done this. But I knew I was coming in here with all of you. I knew I was about to come here and see all of you, and I knew some of you had stood up to your employers. And I didn't want to be the one who walked in and said I was too chicken to do it. And I knew that all of you had my back. I knew that I could stand up to him and I would have support and I would have people who said, yes, you are right. The law protects you too. So that's the world that we are looking to build for refugees, to be able to change that system, that overarching architecture, so that not just in Netherlands, but in Tanzania and in Ecuador and in Thailand and in Jordan, refugees are able to work and feed their families, to send their kids to school, to rebuild a life, and to contribute to their communities. And as Alex Betts, who's sitting in the back of the room, has said, refugees are people with the skills and talents and aspirations to make contributions. What we need to do now is create the policies, create the frameworks, create the architecture that lets them do so everywhere in the world.
Thanks, Emily. So now we are going to hear from Toon Khin, which he is exactly the description, someone who is well able, who is also a refugee. He left Burma, Myanmar, 15 years ago because his community was being persecuted. He'll tell you more about that. He actually was in the UK studying for his PhD in engineering when his own community was attacked in 2012, and 140,000 people were displaced, and unfortunately it's gone downhill since then. He decided to give up his engineering PhD program and has since then become a non-stop, tireless, forceful advocate and activist for his community. And he's going to tell you now about his experience as a rights activist, a human rights activist, and what he's working on. Thanks, Toon Khin.
Thank you very much. I would like to express many thanks organizers and especially the School Forum inviting me to speak for the Rohingya people and also Rohingya refugee situation. And actually I belongs to Rohingya ethnic group minority who are living in western part of Burma. The Rohingya ethnic minority is about 3.5 million. Because of continued persecution, 1.5 million Rohingya forced to flee from Burma. We are the native people of Arakan state, western part of Burma, but the Burmese government not recognize us as a citizen. For example, my grandfather was a parliamentary secretary actually, but I'm not a citizen because of persecution policy and discrimination. You know, when I was Burma, I faced restriction of movement, restriction on marriage. I have seen with my friends who they didn't get a chance to get married, they need to get a pass. And you know, for me, I couldn't go to the university. Like me, more than 1.3 million Rohingyas are facing their education restriction. So the community is totally denied all the rights, denying the right to have you know, education, denying the right to have married, denying the right to have children. And you know, anti-Rohingya campaign is everywhere in Burma. You know, and a state-organized ethnic cleansing created in 2012. And you know, if you look at that, some of you are aware about 140,000 become IDPs. They burned down Rohingya houses, they forced to flee to camps. Including my friends and relatives are there in the camps. And in the camps, they are facing blocking of aid. And so many Rohingya flee from the country after 2012. You have seen in 2015, May, many boat people floating at high sea in Andaman Sea. You know, these people, they didn't get shelter and rescue for 2 to 3 days until international pressure came to Malaysia and Thailand, and their life were ended to human traffickers. We are a people actually manageable minority, but in 21st century we are facing serious persecution inside and outside. If you look at Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh also, they are not getting proper aid and proper shelter at all. Recently I visited to Bangladesh refugee camps, and I met many Rohingya refugees. Even they do not have food for their daily life, and they no medical care, and many Rohingya women were raped by Burmese military, and they do not have any medical care. That's what they told me, you know, with their persecution, what they face is totally devastating when I heard about their crisis, you know. So the other side, if you look at Thailand and Malaysia, Rohingya refugees are ended to human traffickers. They facing exploitation, and we did not see any improvement for these refugees at all. And inside Burma, we are marginalized, and outside we are not getting proper, you know, proper care. So the Rohingyas in 21st century, this according to UN, these are, you know, recent UN report have mentioned they are facing crime against humanity by UN special report I have mentioned. And the other side, UN have mentioned one of the most persecuted people in the world. So these people are, you know, will be wiped out very soon in Burma and outside world. So we need your help to raise the voice for these people. We really need your support to improve this community. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tung Kin. So as Tung Kin just explained about his own community, obviously, but also inside of Burma, Myanmar, but also outside, you know, obviously refugees don't necessarily choose where they are, and when they need support, they need it where they are. Zainab is a member of an organization called the International Trade Center, which is a joint project of the UN and the International Trade Organization that has the very small ambition of eradicating poverty in the world. Their organization works with marginalized communities all over the world, and of course that includes refugees and migrants. And so she's going to speak to you now a little bit about what their program looks like and how they support the realization of rights.
Hello everyone, it's a pleasure to be here and with my panel members and Sarnata and the organizers. We thank them for giving us this opportunity to talk with you today. as Sarnata mentioned, we are a small organization. Our father and mother are quite big and well known, the United Nations and its agencies, and as well as the World Trade Organization. We bring the two streams from these two different DNAs in our own makeup. The development work comes from the UN side, the trade focus comes from the WTO. You are going to ask, how come, Zeynep, you are here sitting as ITC with your other panel members whose mandate is strictly focused on refugees and helping them, whereas we help the entrepreneurship, making economic empowerment and job creation lead to inclusiveness and sustainability, with a focus on marginalized segments of the society in the countries and regions where we call this the bottom of the pyramid, the least developed countries. So, this definition is important in the sense that we work with marginalized communities. Normally, it represented women and youth. However, in this context, it refers to migration, including refugees, economic migrants, and internally displaced people. What ITC does, and today that's what I want to emphasize, is that each different organization, no matter what their main focus is, has something to contribute to this problematic. An organization such as ITC, which works with small and medium enterprises in the developing world, also has a place to play. How does this happen? It happens through bringing in your expertise, what you're good at, your resources, your skill set, your networks, and make it join the forces of others to address a particular problem. In this case, the migration issue. I will give, without going into how we do that and the details, a couple of examples focusing on the three groups of beneficiaries that I just mentioned: IDPs, refugees, and economic migrants, and the three different solutions that ITC brings to the problem. Let's start with internally displaced people. Fleur has done a fantastic job, Jay has done a fantastic job of bringing the refugee aspect and how they have actually organized themselves to help their immediate communities. I will not be able to do that because I'm not one of them. However, I will refer to a lady that we have worked with, Rania, is also a Syrian, who is, after the war, returned back to Damascus to help organize women who have skills, artisanal women, to give them skills, training, and opportunity to produce and then to sell. We have worked with Rania, sorry, not to forget, Rania has done this through what also this, our hosts are supporting, establishing a social enterprise called Made by Women. ITC, working with the social enterprise Made by Women, helps them connect to markets all the way from Damascus. ITC does not do this alone. ITC comes up with the maybe technical skills to, in this case, link Rania and other women working with her to international markets through e-commerce. We do that also working with the private sector. So that's the second aspect that I want to emphasize. ITC having the private sector development, working with the private sector for the private sector in our DNA, we bring automatically, we think about partnering with the big multinationals such as DHL, whereas Rania would not be able to do it on her own. What happens? The products and the goods that they produce in Damascus get shipped off by DHL. And how do they get marketed around the world? Through our partnership with eBay, so that on the e-platforms, these goods can be sold. Fleur, when you mentioned about the shirt story, it immediately resonated. Refugees. To give examples about our work in Kenya and Uganda, with refugee communities, inside camps, outside camps. We have bringing our market analysis tools and methodologies. We can map what kind of businesses are out there, what kind of skill sets exist among the refugee communities, where are the social enterprises that we can work with for, again, organizing and giving work to the communities that we are going to be working with. Where are the buyers? Where is the demand? ITC, again, to highlight where our role is in this, is starting from the market, where there is demand, so that we associate skills and then training and production, and then bring the buyers who actually wants to source sustainably and responsibly, and link the two. Again, I was giving the example of Kenya, Uganda, where working with other larger UN organizations, including IOM, UNHCR, and also the NGO, Norwegian Refugee Council, we have identified that we have skill sets related to artisanal work, related to agriculture, and some IT skills. And by bringing our gear training to, for example, in lifestyle sector and fashion, leather training, and then connecting them to buyers such as campers through social enterprises, made the circle complete. It is the same as working with other partners, such as a university in Geneva and our very own United Nations radio based in also Geneva. We have given job opportunities to refugees who can work from wherever they are and outsource their business skills. I don't want to take too much time. I wanted to just give a few examples of what we do and how we do.
Maybe can I just ask, because I know there's probably a lot of questions and interest in the audience, and I have my own, which I'm going to take the prerogative of skipping so that there's time for everyone else. So if it's okay, hopefully that'll come out in the discussion. Yeah. And certainly I'm sure there'll be time afterwards. So now I would like to give all of you in the audience an opportunity to exchange with people on the panel and to discuss what's come up and questions you have and thoughts or comments you have about what you've heard. Again, I would ask you to wait before you speak until you get the microphone. But with that, are there questions that people would like to ask? Maybe you can introduce yourself. Sorry, sir, right there.
My name is Donald Summers. I work with Altruist Partners. I'm the founder. We accelerate nonprofits to the scale of the problem. I just wanted to ask for your feedback on one of our clients that has a potentially transformational solution to refugees. We believe, my client believes, that the #1 barrier to repatriation and integration into society is identity. Refugees lost their identity. He has an iris scan software that turns an iris into what he calls a uniform identifier. And using blockchain technology, which is also known as distributed ledger technology, takes the iris scan, puts it in a cloud. And we have a number of technology partners that will enable. He's proven this technology in austere environments in Uganda and in Myanmar. And so it works in the field, and we can scan and create a UNID for under $10 a refugee. We have an opportunity in Thailand, which I believe with your population with Rohingya, I'm very excited. We have the partnership among the necessary government officials and the United Nations and the IDC on the ground, and we're ready to deploy this solution for all of the refugees right now. We actually just came to some final partnership agreements a couple of weeks ago. So I just wanted to make everyone in the room aware of this potential solution. It is scalable, but I also wanted to make sure that I'm not drinking my own bathwater. Is identity, and again, because it has blockchain, it protects the identity, the privacy of the refugees. There's no personally identifiable information. So it's about giving the refugees back their identity. And then you can, working with the IOM, the International Trade Center, then you can associate that identity with health screening, with workforce records, in the refugee camp in Thailand, there is some governmental concern. There's a very small number of actors that they don't want to let into the population. That's why it's kept them in camp for 3 decades. But the great majority want to work. But again, we don't have that. We don't have the back and forth with identity and credible records. Anyhow, I hope I've made it clear. Is something like this, does it strike you and other members in the room as a potentially scalable solution? Is if we did have an independently verifiable identity with health records, would that help? It would apparently give the Thai government, it is giving them confidence they can open up this camp. And would that be a solution that would apply elsewhere?
What a great opening question. So I'm going to take maybe 2 or 3. There's a woman over here, and then we can go back to you, sir.
Thanks very much. Fascinating presentations, and I guess I kind of really hooked onto the strapline around sort of agency, not aid. And to that point, if one's interested in reshaping the aid architecture in particular, what do you think could be some of the incentives that could be put in place to emphasize the importance of aid in enabling agency rather than in undermining it? Thanks.
All of you for a really terrific and inspiring panel. My question's to Zeynep. Your ideas about sort of looking holistically at the economy in which refugees are a part or other migrants are a part really resonates for me. I think often when we try to promote jobs opportunities for, say, refugees, international agencies will sort of adopt what might be called a sort of put your hand up if you want to be a tailor or a beekeeper approach, rather than understand actually demand, supply dynamics, the local economy, and where there are those spaces. Now, more and more data is being collected that sort of moves in the direction of looking at impacts on local economies, looking at refugees' economic lives. Emily's mentioned that we're doing some of that, the World Bank's doing some of that. I'd be really interested to hear more about what you're doing in terms of that data side of it, and any ideas you have for how we can better understand the sort of economic ecosystem of which particularly refugees are a part.
We'll take one more. If there's another question, just here. There's a woman here.
Thank you. I have not a question, but actually maybe even a suggestion that what Fleur is doing is something incredible, because I think what you've done is you found these refugees in a place where they are, which happens to be in the Netherlands, and I went to school in Amsterdam, so it's wonderful. But I think what you're doing is giving the refugees dignity. And I think when we talk about where they are, wherever they might be, if they happen to make it to the north, they kind of feel isolated and don't know what to do. And so I'm actually looking to you and see how can this be replicated, because that model that you've created could actually be very helpful to those who are already somewhere, and that reaching them at that level would be wonderful. And I can talk to you individually, but I also want to just thank you for what you're doing.
Okay, great. So we'll just start with that round of questions and go from there. So I think the first question about sort of this idea of identity and the importance of it, maybe Emily and Tunkin, I'd say you both have perspectives on that.
Do you want us to do you want us to take combined questions, or?
Yeah, actually, yeah, if you'd like to speak to more.
Joe's question was also I think related in certain ways. So maybe I'll start with Joe's and pivot to yours. But thinking about the existing aid architecture, what can be done to create more of a pathway from aid to agency, or to do aid in a way that allows and enables refugee agency. For me, I think there are probably 2 key issues. One is that when the architecture that is set up to help refugees is completely distinct today from the architecture that focuses on rights, on opportunity, on access to development opportunities, if we want to put it that way. So in most governments, the US government is one example, so I'll use them because I know them the best, but in most governments you have your human rights, maybe your economic rights or economic empowerment divisions totally siloed from and segregated from the refugees division. That would be as if you said, okay, well we have the, if you said, okay, we have We have the organization that focuses on human rights and economic opportunity, and then we have the Organization for Christians. So all Christians just go over here. I mean, it's a very artificial definition or distinction, right? You have refugees who are people who have the same human rights as other humans. You have refugees who have the same variety of skills, of job and entrepreneurship skills as any other population. And yet you're saying, okay, well, we're not going to treat them as people with rights or people with skills. We're just going to treat them as refugees who have needs and need aid delivered to them and nothing else. And so breaking down those silos is critically important. And so I think that's one thing that our kind of structure is stuck with. And then the other piece is investing in changing the policy frameworks in host countries. So, and what I mean by that is we have billions of dollars going to assist refugees. It's designed to benefit refugees, and it's going almost entirely to what is basically emergency aid. It's basically meeting people's immediate needs for food and basic shelter, but it's not going to the people who could be effective at actually changing host government policy. And at the end of the day, the entity that controls refugees' lives is the government of the country they're living in. So if you want to change policy in Washington, D.C., you fund a lobbyist in Washington, D.C. If you want to change policy in Whitehall, you fund a lobbyist in Whitehall. Why are we not funding lobbyists in Bangkok and Nairobi? And yet almost no dollars that are intended to assist refugees go to people who can engage the governments that control every aspect of refugees' lives. And one of the innovations that Asylum Access has tried to bring to the refugee response world is that we're actually structured as a family of organizations. Each of the Asylum Access entities in various countries is its own national NGO, registered nationally, and led by locals. Because let's be honest, someone who looks like me is not going to convince the government of Malaysia to change anything. We need people who are locals, who understand the system, who have some skin in the game, who say, this is what I want for my country. And yet, most aid dollars, most refugee assistance dollars go to organizations led by foreigners who bring in foreign directors to run their operations in countries where refugees are. And if we could change that, if we could say, okay, we need to fund advocacy, and we need to fund advocacy by locals, I think we would make a huge difference. Now, there is something called the Grand Bargain that has started to push for more funding to go directly to organizations led by locals in refugee hosting countries, or led by locals in countries where humanitarian assistance work is being done. And we think that's a great start, but we think there actually needs to be much more of this, and that it can't just be to aid agencies led by locals, but we also need to start funding this advocacy component. Because until we change the laws, we're going to be stuck 26 years later, still feeding someone but not giving them a chance to rebuild. So those are the two things. And then coming to that idea of identity, I would say it really depends what that identity means. You can have an identity card, but if the government doesn't if that identity card doesn't mean you can work, if it doesn't mean that you can put your kids in school, if it doesn't mean you can go to the national health services and get health care, then it's essentially meaningless. And what we hear from refugees is when we ask them, what are the greatest needs? It's not identity per se. It is security, safety in a country. So being able to stay, not get deported, not get arrested, not get sent to a camp, right? And so that can be facilitated by some sort of identity document if that identity document means something. And then the access to work. Those are the two things. Security, not getting detained, not getting deported, and then being able to work. Those are the two key things we hear from refugees all over the world. Universally, Colombians and Congolese and Cambodians all tell us the same thing.
Thanks, Emily. And Chun Kin, obviously coming from a community that is stateless, so have been stripped of their identity, I expect will have a very different perspective on just what would it mean to be able to record in the cloud forever your identity. And I just wondered if you could speak about that.
Yeah, if you look at Rohingya issue, the government is denying the identity of the Rohingya. It's not exist in Burma, even though in the past it's recognized. But when these refugees fled from the country like Bangladesh, they are not recognized as a Rohingya, and Burmese government is saying they are illegal immigrants from Bangladesh, and Bangladesh government say it's not belongs to our country. So refugees are like about 35 years, 40 years. One refugee was telling me, you know, like we are between the crocodile and snake, you know, something they pushes us from that side and they pushes us from here. When you talk about identity issue, the Rohingya, even they cannot identify themselves in Bangladesh at all. And also when you look at the situation of the refugees, like as Emily mentioned, you know, the government is hosting everything, like you know, all the aids and these things. I should say clearly, it's a lot of corruptions and things like going on those countries. So refugees are not getting the proper aid, even though international community is quite, you know, concerned for Rohingya refugees. We really appreciate that. Aid agencies, they always provide, and governments also they provide a lot of aid from US and OIC countries and others, EU, most of the time, but the refugee situation is still the same. So I think it is important that to lobby the policymaker about this issue. This is very important. Thanks.
Thanks, Tunkin. I was just, as you were speaking, and just Tunkin and I have known each other for a long time, and I was thinking about a time that we met with one of your colleagues, and he was talking about the need for almost like an ancestry.com for the Rohingya people, because having been stripped of their identity and documents, and with so much, almost half the community exiled now, they have no way to trace each other, to stay in touch, and also to have their own ancestry, which allows them also to prove identity as they are forced to flee over and over again from different countries. So it just made me think of that, and it sounds like we'll have more of a discussion about that. I just wanted to also say I really appreciated both of you, how you spoke about the need for lobbying, the need for change in laws. Like Emily said, the need for people who live in these countries, speak the languages, understand the context, obviously know their own politics, to be doing that work. And I just wanted to mention, obviously I'm at Oxfam International, which we do humanitarian assistance, we do development funding, but we also have that critique. And one of the things we're doing is moving our headquarters from Oxford, where we were established, to Nairobi. And that will happen by the end of 2018. And that is a recognition of the need to be not only having Southern leadership, but having people from the Global South as our leaders. So maybe I won't have a job in a few years at Oxfam International, but that will be a sign of, I think, great progress for the organization. I know there were other questions, so I want to give both of you an opportunity. Zainab, there was a question about DataCide and better understanding the economic ecosystems for which refugees are a part. So perhaps you could speak to that, and then I know there was something that I wanted to ask you to speak to as well. And then we'll have, just looking at time, we have 10 minutes, so hopefully we'll have time for another round of questions or comments.
Thank you very much for the question. I think it's very key in the sense when we talk about market-driven solutions, the development of those market-driven solutions indeed needs to be data-based. If it is not data-based, then we have not done our job properly, and it doesn't lead to sustainability. A solution that we develop or a sector that we go in will die after a few years. Therefore, sustainability and success, economic viability, relies on accurate data and collection. Now, it is a core business area of ITC that we have recently started to apply to the refugee problematic. Refugee problematic is not our core business, or is not our core group of beneficiaries. However, just as I said, is we all have to think innovatively and think where we have value added to bring in. Therefore, I will speak with caution, because all our interventions are at a pilot scale in different countries. And one of our biggest challenges, if you ask me, Zeynep, what is your biggest challenge? I would say replicability and scalability of these pilot initiatives that we test in different countries and contexts. Data is the basis of it. We bring our market analysis tools that we do to look at normally in any of our beneficiary countries, which of the sectors and where in the value and supply chains there are gaps. Where are the opportunities for them to sell? Because after all, we are talking about internationalization, competitiveness at a global scale, so that these companies or sectors or producers and the whole value chain can develop enough so that they can trade and sell globally to international markets. We also have tools which identify export potential. It's called the export potential map. We look in countries, in regions, within countries. We look at sectors. We apply these I'm not going to bore all of you with technical details, just to say that we apply our core business tools and methodologies in the context of where refugees exist and do an analysis of the business fauna and flora and the skills analysis. So our database, when it comes to refugees, is not really developed or evolved. However, we are there and we are just starting. And I hope it helps others also who are operating in this area.
Thanks, Zeynep.
You're welcome.
And I hope there will be an opportunity afterwards for even more discussion. Fleur, if you could speak to, it was actually, in a way, a similar question, obviously really impressive receiving of what you're doing. And then is it replicable? Is it possible to do this in other parts of the Netherlands, in other countries?
Yeah, we are, of course, thinking of that. And I think first what we have to do is see what are the real successes in our method. And one of the most important things what we do is that it's about trust, ownership, and that people are their own entrepreneurs. So of course, when you're in, let's say, a shelter where there's crisis and you're on the border in Jordan, then it's completely different. Now people are in the Netherlands. So for us, it's really important that locals, like Dutch people, work together with refugees. So in order to find out how it works in the Netherlands, we have all these funny issues of two Syrian architects who designed our coffee bar. And I said, where are the tables? He said, well, you just drink your coffee and then you go. And I said, yeah, but in Holland, we want to sit down with a cappuccino and then on your laptop. And he's like, yeah, but no, so you have all these cultural differences. But I think for us, it's really important that there's autonomy and also trust that Faris, our event manager, is our event manager, and that's not me who's doing the events. He's the specialist in it, but he of course needs sometimes a Dutch event manager for the network or to understand. So replicable, I don't know. We are very careful in trying also to keep it a little bit in the shade now, because we got a lot of media attention, and then people are asking, oh, can you do it also there? And I think there's some elements which you can always do on a shelter. And for me, the most important thing is let refugees run the center themselves, Why don't we do that? Why is there an expensive gardener doing the gardening? I don't understand that. So that's also what we try to do. There's so many people doing nothing, and they're professionals, so we can just make use of that. So I don't have a very clear answer, but I'm working on it. Yeah.
Probably be interested in what other people's experiences as well, whether now or afterward. So we have time for a few more questions. I know you had one. Sorry, just the gentleman here, close to you, and there's one over here, and I know there's one. Okay, there's one here, and we might not. Maybe we'll have time for answers afterwards, if not now. But we'll get the questions out anyway, or the comments. So go ahead.
Hello, my name is Zishan. I work with an organization called Educate Girls. And I'm going to ask a question that my 12-year-old neighbor asked me when she came to know about the refugee crisis after watching the famous photograph of a child washed ashore, the child in the red t-shirt. And we discussed a lot about the refugee crisis, and she asked me a question, which may sound very simplistic. But she asked me that, why do these people and who do all these bad things to people because they have to, and then they have to leave their country, why are we not stopping them? Why are we not pressurizing governments and people who provide them with weapons or provide them with funding or buy their oil and provide them with more money to do this wrong stuff? That got me thinking, and that's the question I want to ask you, that whether is there work being done on that side as well, where we are talking to countries to take in refugees, but also are we talking to countries to stop making refugees? Thank you, that's my question.
Thank you. Yeah, sir.
I just wanted to go to the 99% of refugees who are not in the rich world, but rather in the South. And Uganda is held out as a model for so many other countries to follow for its hospitality. I did this story last year for PBS and interviewed Alex Betts for it at a time when there were 500,000 refugees in Uganda who were given all the hospitality. That number is effectively doubled, and it's multiplying just hugely by the day from South Sudan. And I'm just wondering, the question is there a carrying capacity at, even politically in places which don't have to worry about re-election, as in Uganda? Is there a carrying capacity beyond which this becomes just untenable, even in the most hospitable environment such as Uganda?
Yeah, thank you. Maybe we can take one more, two. You had your hand there, sorry.
Thanks. Simon Adams, just an observation and a question. I mean, the observation, so much of this, it seems to me, comes down to options. No one chooses to be a refugee. My own family comes from Northern Ireland, and when the conflict in Northern Ireland closed in around their lives, they left by boat and migrated to the other side of the world, which is why I have this unusual accent. But they had options, and they were welcomed. They weren't scorned. They had the benefit of white skins and speaking the English language, and I think that is definitely part of it. But, with 65 million people in the world displaced, not just refugees, there's also internally displaced in many of these countries that we're talking about as well. These people aren't coming to our countries because they're in search of the new iPhone. They're coming because they don't have options where they are. So I think this is, the great moral crisis of our time. And so I really applaud all the speakers, because I think they're really showing about how they're trying to create options in the countries where people arrive. And I agree completely with the other speaker. My organization works on trying to deal with those governments and stop these things from happening. But my question is to Tun Kin, which is, the ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya is happening under the leadership of a Nobel Peace Prize winner and her government. And given the strong connections she has to international civil society and to many people who supported her under house arrest over many, many years, what more pressure can be applied to the government of Myanmar to deal with the Rohingya issue in a way which is actually in keeping with international human rights standards, and it's not about exterminating them as a people?
Thank you. So another great question. So I'm just going to take the prerogative of quickly addressing the first two, because I know there's not much time and I want Tun Kin to have it. So first, on going after those who create refugees, absolutely inherently political. That's what makes it hard. It should be done. I will just say that Oxfam, where I work, we've actually sued the British government because it's supplying arms to Saudi Arabia, which has a campaign that is our position is creating violations of international humanitarian law. So that case has been argued. We're waiting for a decision from the judges. That's one example. But we do need to be more creative about how we do this, because we're not doing well as an international community in holding those to account, those who create refugees. And just on the carrying capacity, I wanted to address that because it's true. I mean, the reality is that all the countries we're talking about here are countries that are taking some responsibility, and that's important. And of course, as we know, 99% are in the global South. So I work on refugee and migrant rights, and one of my primary advocacy goals is a concrete mechanism for responsibility sharing that actually what it would do is look at the actual capacity of governments to receive, protect, and care for people who are fleeing crises, and that when they exceed that capacity, so Uganda being an example of a country that actually does quite well overall in comparison to other countries, but yes, right now it has thousands of people are coming over every day right now. And is there a tipping point where their ability to continue to permit freedom of movement, access to work, land, changes? And so that would be, for us, I think, a trigger where there is a responsibility for other countries around the world to step in and to help, and to do so by making sure that people still have access to work, they still have the right to move freely. So that's just one example there, but there's plenty to talk about. Tung Kin, I'd like you, if you don't mind, to help us to conclude with this very big question.
Yes, this is very reasonable question, and everywhere for me I face that. If I connect the other question, we have to stop also the government not producing the refugees. So it's connected. First thing, this is Rohingyas are facing systematic persecution in Burma. This is not just like other ethnic groups compared with others in Burma. Like many other ethnic groups are facing persecution, but Rohingyas are a systematic persecution, a policy designed by many decades by the Burmese military. And so from a starting point, they strip of ethnicity, citizenship, restriction of movement, marriage, education, imposed anti-Rohingya campaign, and burning down their houses and pushing them to the camps and blocking the aid, and then whether you want to live in this country without food or leave from the country. That is two options the government given. So under of NLD government, which is led by Aung San Suu Kyi, for me, we've been Rohingya people supported for human rights and democracy for many years. So NLD, a fan of Aung San Suu Kyi. I campaigned for her, for more than 10 years. So she's not speaking up, unfortunately. There is, I think, people are seeing different angle, but for now what we can see under of our government is still under of Aung San Suu Kyi, all military regime policies are practicing. Still people are facing the same persecution. So I think for the pressure point for Aung San Suu Kyi, she is a part of global society. She was a Nobel Peace Prize winner. She studied this university here in Oxford. This is the governments are approaching very soft way, and international community soft approach is not working. International community must come stronger to pressure her. So people see different way. She is even though she's in power, military is still defense minister and home ministry are under of military. So these are controlling, police and military are controlling by this military. But still, she could do a lot of things. She didn't do that at all, in my opinion, as a Rohingya, what I've seen. Also, her government, Aung San Suu Kyi's government, ministries are spreading anti-Rohingya speeches. This is what's going on. Militaries are killing the Rohingyas. So, unfortunately, we are really in a and the other side, both parties, they politicize the Rohingya issue. Like the more who can hate the Rohingya, he can get much vote in Burma. That is the situation, unfortunately. So Aung San Suu Kyi, she is an icon. She should speak up, but she's not. The problem is, international community soft approach. As I mentioned earlier, UN special report I have mentioned, what's happening to the Rohingya community is crime against humanity. She called for commission of inquiry as a special reporter in UN last few days ago, I think. But the governments are not supporting for commission of inquiry to investigate human rights abuses, violating international law against Rohingya. They are not supporting that. So we have to come forward a stronger lobby to lobby this government. This is important. The governments, some are, I have to say frankly, for the interest of economics, they are not speaking up.
I'm sorry to cut you off. All of these are really important discussions. So we have gone a little over time. I apologize to all of you for not having managed the time better myself, but obviously this is a vibrant discussion and there's so much here. So I hope all of us can stay afterwards so that if people have more questions or comments, we can continue that discussion. Thank you to the panel.